有请本轮环节讨论嘉宾 Jules Coleman G30 Project 高级顾问李文，上海科技大学创业与管理科学院院长 James Landay， 斯坦福大学计算机科学教授 Sanjiv Misra Apollo Global Management 公司亚太区咨询委员会主席，以及我们的主持嘉宾陈丁红，好未来教育集团海外首席顾问。
好，各位嘉宾我们上午好，非常荣幸今天我能在这里主持这场圆桌论坛。我们的这个讨论呢会以英文的方式来进行。So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're gonna get started with our next roundtable discussion. Actually, before I get started, I would like to have the special distinguished guest speakers to introduce themselves briefly. Should I start from my very far left?
Good morning. I'm Sandeep Mishra. Background in investment banking, 21 years at Goldman Sachs and Citigroup in New York and Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore. Spent the last 10 years doing a variety of things around investing and as a non-executive chairman of Follow Management in Asia. From an education standpoint, I spent 12 years on the board of trustees of the Singapore Management University, which was particularly interesting because it was years 4 through 16 of the university's life, so one of the younger universities in Asia, and on the board of the National University Health System, which is the integrated education research clinical facility in Singapore.
I'm James Landay. I'm a professor of computer science at Stanford. My research interests are in the area of human-computer interaction and AI, or artificial intelligence. And I'm specifically interested in working on problems that I think are big problems facing the planet in terms of the environment, health, and education. I feel as an academic we should really be pushing on the problems that we face, and these problems are problems that are shared by many countries, but especially the United States and China. So I work on a lot of these projects collaboratively with Chinese universities and companies.
各位嘉宾早上好，我是李梅。My name is May. As Joy said, I am the Dean of the School of Entrepreneurship and Management at ShanghaiTech, New University in Shanghai. My background comprises of a long career as a lawyer, and then the bulk of my career was spent all on Wall Street, also at Goldman Sachs, both in the legal department and on the trading floor. I was an entrepreneur for many years. And then 10 years ago, I began my career in higher education, first as the Vice Chancellor at New York University. I led the effort to establish ShanghaiTech. And then from there, 4 years ago, I joined ShanghaiTech as the Dean to create a curriculum around innovation and entrepreneurship for Chinese science and engineering students. And in that capacity, I designed a curriculum and I teach a large number of courses on innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as do research in those areas, particularly comparing the US and the Chinese ecosystems.
Hello, I'm Jules Coleman. I spent 40 plus years in higher education, beginning my career at Berkeley, and spent 30 years as a professor of law and philosophy at Yale. I also taught game theory in political science and economics, and then became senior vice provost for academic planning at New York University, where I played a role, where I met May and played a role in helping NYU move into Abu Dhabi. Having done that and been in charge of academic planning throughout the university as a whole, I was able to rise above the extremely low bar for constituting an expert in global education. And having been certified as somewhat of an expert in global education, I began a career as an advisor to education projects around the world, primarily now with Chris Whittle and the Chris Whittle School and Studios, and also most recently with GSV.
Okay, great, welcome. And my name is Joy. I'm the executive advisor for TAO. I've probably had like 20 years experiences in education industry, and I'm now living in Silicon Valley, but I travel and work in between US and China. Actually, today's topic is talking about innovative higher education. So nowadays, it's difficult to mention higher education without hearing innovation, renovation, reform, change. There have been so many things we have already done here in the higher education landscape. It's difficult to talk about too many renovation steps. So we want to narrow a little bit here. So we want to talk about how higher education better preparing the kids' life through their renovation, innovation, and change. So actually, you guys have been working in the higher education area for years and years. You probably have already seen or experienced or maybe even created or developed some creative ways of teaching. So my first question is, will you guys share with us some of the innovative ways of teaching? So Jules, you want to start?
Well, I would like to start, but I'm going to be disappointing. I think the fundamental question we want to ask first is why there has been so little actual innovation at the level of higher education with regard to teaching. And that, so that the question is, what forces are at play that tend to restrict the development or the speed at which innovation in teaching at higher education actually takes place. So what I'd like to do is indicate a couple of the forces which have restricted the extent to which higher education has mobilized innovation in teaching, and what the factors that are likely to be which will actually increase the speed at which innovation occurs in the future. So the factors that restrict it are, some are very obvious. Among the ones that are most obvious is that university development in terms of its instruction tends to be organic from the faculty up. It's not like other forms of education, hierarchical in the sense of central administration indicating the methods, the pedagogy, and so on. And one of the prized possessions in higher education is the idea of academic freedom, and so most people take it not only to have the responsibility of the agency to determine the content of the materials that they teach, but the mechanisms by which they do so. So the fact that innovation is going to come organically. Second, related to that, is that there, in the United States, there's been an elimination of the 65-year-old rule for getting out of education. So this means the turnover in education has gone at a much slower rate than it would have gone otherwise. So the most innovative teachers tend to be the younger teachers who are more familiar with advances in technology, but they are a smaller percentage of the university than they would otherwise be. The third is owed to a very familiar distinction drawn by Oliver Williamson, my former colleague at Yale, between assets that you develop that are specific to a particular relationship and assets that you develop which are more broadly usable. So that most people who become teachers have devoted an enormous amount of investment in assets that are specific to a particular mechanism and mode of instruction. They've gone to school for 25 years. They've then worked on a research project for 15 years. They've approached the problem in particular ways, and they've learned how to convey that information in particular ways. So that is, makes it very difficult for them to switch over quickly. The people who are most likely to switch over quickly are individuals with a shorter investment in asset-specific resources, which are younger faculty. So, of course, this leads to the question, what are the factors that are likely to increase the rate of innovation in higher education instruction? One is, of course, the ultimate and eventual changeover to younger and younger faculty, eventually moving into the academy. The second is that the factors that have influence on universities, of which there are actually very few, are both above the university and below the university. So let's take the ones above the university. The ones that are above the university, primarily I'm talking about the alumni of the university. So the pressure of the alumni on the university to make courses available to them after graduation, right, So most of education was basically front-loaded in a person's life between the ages of 3 and 25, and then that education was supposed to carry you for the rest of your life. That now no longer turns out to be a viable approach because people have to retrain themselves in other jobs as the economy is changing before them. In addition, people over the age of 50 say that the thing they would like to do most is learn a new subject. So the thing that universities need to do, and are very likely to do, is become the locus of lifelong educational opportunities for their alumni, so that their alumni are always turning back to the universities they went to, other than to just go to football games, but to continue to learn subjects. Now, those subjects are not available on campus to the alumni. They have to be spread to the alumni in a variety of different mechanisms in different ways. This is likely to produce a whole new class of students, even for the most conservative faculty members, that they can reach, who are interesting. But the way in which they'll reach them successfully is only through the use of innovative mechanisms like online teaching and the like. The second is the pressure from below, namely people from K through 12. So as K through 12 changes with regard to its pedagogy, it will be, and which it is, and the pressures to doing so are greater than ever. As that occurs, it's going to be harder and harder for the universities meeting their freshman class to go back to the conventional ways of teaching that's not responsive to the more personalized, stage, not age, education that the students would have experienced through the first 12 years of their education, thereby increasing the likelihood that educational innovation in pedagogy in universities will pick up.
Cool. So James, actually I want to throw this question to you as well. You come from Silicon Valley. Stanford is sitting in the epicenter of the innovation center over there. So have you seen any innovative ways about teaching, learning from your side?
I mean, obviously we've seen lots of these experiments in online education, from MOOCs to flipped classrooms, etc. So people do innovate. You don't see a lot of results necessarily showing you it's better. I think the biggest innovation from the students' perspective is simply recording the courses so they don't have to show up and watch it at their leisure at whatever speed they want, or repeat it when their students seem to like that. I think a lot more of the innovation is in terms of the work outside of lectures, so project work. There's much more in my 25 years in academia, a lot more project work than there used to be, a lot more teamwork. These are the skills, obviously, that employers say they need, but it's also a better way for people to learn. It's an active-based learning, as you heard about previously. So I think a lot of that is happening, and it's below the radar. I think this idea that you think of the university as just lectures, it's kind of an outdated concept. Yes, lectures are still there, but there's a lot of other things that go on. And I think the big critical question to ask when thinking about what is innovation in education is to think, well, what is the university about? Is it about just this content transmission? That's only right. That's what most of these companies work on, who are making this more personalized and online, which is good. But that's a tiny piece of what happens in the university. Most of what the students learn, I like to say, is in the laundry room at night with a dorm mate having a debate over some topic, or in a car at 2 a.m. going to get Chinese food in Chinatown. These are where a lot of the education occurs, and we need to make sure we don't forget this, because we're going to get rid of the important pieces.
So I'd actually like to add something, having had experience both in the U.S. and China, and I too, similarly to Jules and to James, want to take a step back and think about what the purpose of education is. So in Chinese, a long time ago, we used to say that people with a higher education had wenhua, had culture. There's a lot of focus now on getting jobs. And while I understand that getting a job is extraordinarily important for a country's future, for the individual's future, for economic growth, there's much more that happens at the age of 18 for those 4 years to 21 or 22 that comprises an education that we should consider. And I think that the teaching and the learning that occurs inside of a university starts from the moment the individual walks into the campus until the day the person leaves the campus. And then as Jules says, particularly now, there's all sorts of alumni activity. But the education is not only to cultivate knowledge, information, and critical thinking, which we can talk about later, but also it's the first time in an individual's life when they step away from their parents, where they're actually learning to be grown-ups. So in the 1500s, universities served the purpose of creating responsible and conscientious citizens. That's also a fundamental piece of what universities do. And we create knowledge and we transmit knowledge. The transmission of the knowledge is almost the smallest piece of what we do. And therefore, when we talk about teaching in innovative ways, there is outside of the classroom teaching, there are student clubs. We should not forget that the most powerful learning that often happens is amongst peers. So peer learning is an extraordinarily effective way. And so looking at peer learning and how students learn from each other is another place that universities have innovated and have done in a much more fundamental way than I think outsiders have insight into.
Actually, May, you just mentioned something I want to highlight is not only from the innovative way of teaching, but also how they learn, what they learn. So actually, this leads to my next question is, now very often you just brought up the complaints. We very often hear, which is the kids are not ready upon their graduation. People highlight a lot on job readiness. Actually, I personally think higher education should be more than that. It's not all about getting the job. I think higher education is to get them ready for their future life, for their future career. So I would also like to hear something from Sanjiv. What's your viewpoint in this area?
Yeah, you're going to get by far the most non-academic view from me, which is, at the end of the day, the bane of higher education is the obsession with the job at the end of it. And what that translates into, from the standpoint of university management, is to distill it down to metrics like placement percentage, starting salary, and it's very hard to get to the third metric because those two seem to overwhelm every other aspect of the academic pursuit. That sits on one side. The other side of it, and I see this to a great degree in Asia, and I've sort of lived with this in my experience at SMU, is the obsession with grades, with the academic, highly numeric, highly translatable into academic performance metrics approach, where it's all about textbooks, grades, exams. We live in an age where information is available at the touch of a keyboard. What is sharply lacking is taking that information and converting it into insight, into knowledge, and into applicable wisdom that can be used going forward. And so from my perspective, the practices that we need to be much more focused on is developing a much more real-world sense of imbibing knowledge and applying that knowledge. The other aspect of it that I think we spend very little time around in universities that is important is, for want of a more crisp phrase, tolerance for ambiguity. We tend to live in a world which is much more amorphous, which is much harder to put in neat boxes or place in a column. And for young people to understand that that's a fact of life, that's a reality, and they need to be able to draw on a very broad array of unstructured information and to be able to then parlay it into some conclusions that they can then discuss, engage with their peers, and come up with a path forward, which may or may not be the unique best way forward and is subject therefore to amendment and correction, is something we, I believe, need to spend a lot more time doing around our university education protocols.
Okay, actually my next question, before I get to my next question, I want to bring two thoughts from my side that point as well. One is, as I mentioned, although higher education is to help the kids to learn as more as possible, but there should be more college need to provide to them. And also another point is, I think not only university is the key player there to get kids ready for their future life, for their future job. I think there should be an ecosystem to get the students ready for their future life. For example, the policy from the government and also society and also the industry. Actually, during the past couple of months, I've been working very closely with Stanford Computer Science Department. I've got to know there's a kind of interesting university industry partnership relationship. They are doing very well, which not only like the academic world brings those research results to support industry to develop, but also industry involves in the university's activities to help them to bring lots of activities for the students. So before they graduate, they get exposures to the rest of the world, like how the real business world is going to be. So with this being said, I probably want to have James to talk more about what you guys are doing over there, your best practices from university industry relationship side.
So I don't know if I would say Stanford is necessarily the best at this, but involving undergraduates in research is another place where they get an education. So, for example, this summer I had 16 undergraduate students working with me directly, not through a postdoc or a graduate student, on a variety of projects. Normally during the year we have dozens of undergraduates working in our projects. And so that's another experience that they get. I'd say a place that probably is the premier place for this is MIT, where you would be thought of as weird if you didn't do one of these year ops or a research opportunity. At Stanford, I'm involved in trying to really expand that within our computer science department, which is the biggest major on campus. And especially for underrepresented students, low-income students, where this is even less common because in their households they haven't even possibly thought about this. And so we're really trying to expand our efforts at recruiting that. So this research, working with faculty, often working with companies like we're doing a smart tutoring project with Tao, is another way for them to get experience that's outside of the classroom and is often not something that people are thinking about when they think about, well, what's it mean to get a degree at a research university?
And May, I know you probably have something at from China side. What we are doing there?
So this is a relatively new area in China. At my school, actually, we have an entire innovation curriculum where we have relationships with individual companies. We ask companies like Microsoft, hire Hangao, so German companies, Chinese companies, US companies, to work with either me or one of my faculty members. We actually look at a specific business challenge that business is facing in China. We create a real live problem for our students. We allow 15 to 25 students to enroll in that class, and then we give them that challenge at the beginning of the semester. They spend the balance of the semester visiting the company, working then in teams under the advisement of the faculty to create actual solutions to the company's problems, and at the end of the semester, they present their solution to the company. I think this is a relatively new innovation inside of Chinese higher education. As far as I know, we're the only university that's doing that. I spearheaded that effort. We're trying to expand that, but you need faculty who are able to do both the theory as well as the actual practical application. So you have to have an understanding of business, as well as then the willingness to coach the students on some fundamental skills like presentation, like working together in teams, and be willing to spend the time, because the bulk of that work is done outside of the classroom. But we have, I would say, a dozen classes like that between the spring and the summer semester.
Can I add a little something to that? So one thing is, a lot of it is being done by university faculty members, but not through the authorization of their particular departments or their particular universities. So let me give an example. So the New York Academy of Sciences has created a program of challenges that are done with normally large corporations that identify a particular problem. take a problem like clean water or sustainable food in various parts, sustainable agriculture in various parts of the world. The mentors for these programs are faculty members in academic, typically research universities, but not through their authorization as faculty members in those universities. What they do is help mentor students around the world who join up through the program that the New York Academy of Sciences has done. People identify themselves, students identify themselves as individuals who would like to form cooperatives and collaborative activities to help solve this problem. They are then mentored by the scientists from the universities to identify the problem, formulate it in an interesting way, work through a range of potential solutions, offer one up, present a brief on behalf of it. So university faculty are engaged in these innovative partnerships with students from all around the world, but not in the course rooms of their universities, in part because the structures of their universities don't naturally give rise to these kinds of opportunities.
I wonder how sustainable those efforts are, because faculty, as you know, feel they're overworked and doing too many things, and if they're not compensated by their employer or their department, whatever, for the service, whether they can keep these things going.
I have an answer to that because I work with the New York Academy of Sciences on this. So the answer to that is this. The largest group of people who are willing to do this are postdocs, right? Who are looking for ways of getting themselves experienced and known. As far as the university faculty members who are willing to do this, they have an extremely strong incentive to increase the number of people in the sciences. And that they view as a payoff independent of their compensation. And that is why it's sustainable.
Sanjiv.
So to me, there's another dimension to this which I think of as being very valuable, which is the partnership between the university and industry creates a long-term feedback loop. All too often, there's a vacuum or a breakdown in communication or expectation in terms of what universities are preparing students to do and how they end up as employees, professionals, not just at the get-go, but 3, 5, 10 years down the road. And by building these partnerships, there is the ability to give a real-time feedback where there is an opportunity to reassess whether students are being appropriately prepared for those jobs in industry, but equally, if not more importantly, the ability to provide early and mid-career stage tweaking of skills and real-world training around the softer elements of management and leadership that all too often are difficult to provide and at the early stage, but which it's only possible to be able to build partnerships with if both sides feel like they have a long-term vested interest.
That's great discussion. Actually, this makes me think definitely there are improvements there at university side from the higher education landscape. But still, we have so many complaints about higher education, and you guys probably have seen some of the real problems there. So actually, this is my last question, which is more like an open question. If you guys can bring up one of the biggest problems you've ever seen from the higher education landscape, but I still want my roundtable to be more constructive. So instead of just bringing the problem, so if you guys can also share with us some of the innovative ways, solutions we can solve the problem or improve it, that will be really great. So,
okay. I'm happy to go first on this. So one of the main ways of getting at the central problem that higher education faces is to recall that education is a bundled good. So that is, so you have two different kinds of ways of thinking about things. Goods are typically bundled and then they're disaggregated. So if you think of Amazon, Amazon is the classic disaggregator. So what Amazon did was taking the shopping experience and took the walking and talking out of it and just did the purchasing, right? So they disaggregated what was a bundled good, in effect, going shopping. So universities are bundled goods. They provide a variety of things. One of the things that they provide is offloading your children between the ages of 18 and 22 and allowing them to grow up on their own with a group of peers. Another thing that happens during education is the socialization of individuals with peer groups on their own. Third thing that goes on is you meet your future spouses or friends for life. Another thing that goes on is basically you network. Another thing that goes on is you receive educational content. And the last thing that goes on is you receive certification. So one of the things that's a problem in a bundled good is that it's not transparent with regard to the various values and prices of its component parts. So when people try to disrupt education, right, here's the main problem with education once you keep that in mind. There are, in the United States alone, roughly 4,000 four-year colleges and universities that are working under the same business model that actually applies to 25 of them. And one of the reasons they're able to do this is because of the absence of transparency with regard to the goods that they're bundling. So the question about one of the problems that universities face is disaggregation. The question is, so you take how have people tried to disaggregate so far? It's been through the provision of content. So if you look at Coursera, Coursera is thought to be basically a disaggregator and a disruptor. Why? Because it provides content free. So that's thinking that the main good that education provides is content, and the best way to undermine it and to flip it around is to provide content free through Coursera or something like Coursera or edX or whatever it is. But in fact, that's not the case. The most valuable good that the university provides is certification. That is, the one that has the highest value to end users or end purchasers, namely businesses, jobs, employment. They believe that the university is providing a certification. Now, whenever we feel it's not an adequate certification, what universities have done is up the certification. So being a college graduate is not sufficient for certification, getting a master's degree is. So then getting a master's degree in addition to a college degree is adequate for certification. But in fact, if you want to really truly disrupt education, what you have to do is go around to the people who buy the certification, the people who believe that universities are in fact adequate certifiers. So what we're going to find in higher education is people are going to inquire as to what skills are actually needed in order to be able to do this job. What form of certification, what alternative mechanism of certification is there? And then universities will be beneficiaries in an odd sense. They'll have to reconceptualize what they do and what they do well. So the vast majority of universities will do very well with regard to wellness training, teaching in small groups. People will learn online, but they will then meet in small groups. And so there'll be a lot more consolidation of universities. Notice, if you were to ask yourself, this will be the last comment I make, I'm trying to run through a lot of things. If you ask yourself 15 years ago, what are the main industries in the world that see no consolidation and mergers and acquisitions and things like this, you would have said healthcare, governments, philanthropy, and universities, schools. Now, healthcare is no longer true. There's a tremendous amount of consolidation and mergers and acquisitions. But universities continue to be completely localized with very little mergers and acquisition, and that's what's going to change.
So I may still have a little bit time for another problem and solutions from the rest of the guest speakers.
So I'll answer it from two different perspectives. I think that there's always a danger in answering these questions by comparing the U.S. and Chinese ecosystems. 中国的生态跟国外的生态完全不一样。So I think that inside of China, we have a different base from where we start. So we don't have private universities here. Clearly, expanding the number of private universities is a big initiative inside of China, and I think actually a very important one. I think the second piece is that there is an excessive focus on grades, on jobs, and on knowledge as opposed to development of the entire individual. The purpose of education in China has become very, very, very narrowly focused, and I think it is really to the sort of disadvantage of our students. I teach now, I've taught 2,000, 3,000 undergraduate students in China, and my focus really is on connecting their cognitive learning with their emotional well-being, because without that, the innovation that China is searching for will be lagging very far behind.
That's great, actually. I think this is a very meaningful, interesting, and a very constructive discussion we have had here during the past 15 minutes. You guys coming from different parts of the world, and I know GES, we have guests coming from different parts of the world. I think that's the beauty of GES, is to have the world-class leaders from education sector. So we come here, we meet, we talk, and we try to discuss and figure out what is the best solution for education. So in that way, we kind of better prepare the kids for their future so they can really dream big and fly high. So with this being said, this will be the end of our roundtable. Thank you so much for being with us this morning here. Thank you.